Good morning, everyone. The February 3rd, 2016 meeting of the Environmental Quality Board is called to order. I'm John Quigley, Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection and Chair of the Board. Just want to note for everyone what should be obvious. We are broadcasting this meeting live, so all of your microphones are on. You don't need to push any buttons. They're all being controlled remotely. Let's go around the room and take a moment to introduce ourselves.
I'm Kim Child, Director of the Bureau of Regulatory Counsel for DEP and Counsel to the Board.
I'm Sharon Watkins. I'm the State Epidemiologist and Director for the Bureau of Environmental Epidemiology and Epidemiology for the state of Florida.
Michael Smith, Executive Deputy Secretary, Department of Agriculture, representing Secretary Russell Redding.
Paul Opio, alternate for Secretary Dennis Devin, DCED.
John Walliser, Citizens Advisory Council.
Don Welsh, Citizens Advisory Council.
William Fink, Citizens Advisory Council.
Cynthia Caro, Citizens Advisory Council.
Sam Robinson, representing Secretary of Policy and Planning, John Hanger.
Doug McLaren, alternate for Jim Vaughn, Historical and Museum Commission.
Good morning, Liz Nolan. I'm an attorney with the Office of Chief Counsel, Bureau of Regulatory Counsel.
Scott Perry, Deputy Secretary for DEP's Office of Oil and Gas Management.
Good morning, Kirk Lepkowski, Director of the Bureau of Oil and Gas Planning and Program Management, PADEP.
Good morning, Eileen Cipriani, representing Secretary Kathy Mandarino of the Department of Labor and Industry.
Roger Cohen, Policy Director at PennDOT, representing Secretary of Transportation Leslie Richards.
Gladys Brown, Chair of the Public Utility Commission.
Greg Vitale, State Representative from Delaware and Montgomery counties.
Jonathan Lutz, alternate for Representative John Marr. I will note that Representative Marr will be here. He's caught in traffic.
I'm Richard Fox, alternate for Senator John Udicak.
Gene Yaw, I'm Chairman of the Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee.
Michael DiMatteo with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, representing Matthew Ho.
Burt Wade, Citizens Advisory Council.
John Arway, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission.
DEP's Regulatory Coordinator.
And Pat McDonald, Policy Director, DEP.
All right, thank you all. Let's get right to work. The first item of business before the board today is the approval of the minutes from the November 17th, 2015 board meeting. You all have those minutes. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Is there a motion to adopt the minutes of the November 17th meeting? Eileen, and second by Representative Vitale. Those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, so ordered. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted to approve the minutes as presented. The next item of business before the board today is consideration of the final rulemaking to revise Chapter 78 in Title 25 of the Pennsylvania Code related to conventional oil and gas wells, and to establish a new Chapter 78A related to unconventional oil and gas wells. Here's how we're going to proceed this morning. The board will first hear a presentation from the Department of Environmental Protection on the rulemaking under consideration. We estimate that the presentation will take about 30 minutes. The board will then hear two 10-minute presentations, the first from the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee and the second from the Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Board. As you may recall, the board voted to allow the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee to make this 10-minute presentation at our last board meeting. The Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Board also requested the opportunity to make a presentation and is also being given 10 minutes to do so. Immediately following these presentations, the board will have an opportunity to ask department staff questions about provisions in the final rulemaking to obtain any needed clarification, and then we will proceed with our formal consideration of the rulemaking. So at this point, I want to turn the microphone over to Scott Perry, Deputy Secretary for Oil and Gas Management, who will present the Chapter 78 and Chapter 78A final rulemaking. Scott and team.
Thank you very much, Secretary Quigley. Before I get into the substance of the presentation, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge the extremely hard work that so many people within the department have done to bring this rulemaking to this board today. If I tried to thank everyone that was involved, I'm sure the Secretary would cue the music and I'd get the hook, but I definitely need to point to Kirk Lepkowski, Liz Nolan, and Joe Adams. The nights, weekends, and holidays they sacrificed to bring this excellent work product to the board's attention. It definitely needs to be acknowledged, and I appreciate your tremendous public service. The eyes of the world are indeed on Pennsylvania as an energy leader. And I hope everyone in this room is proud to know that Pennsylvania DEP is indeed an international leader in environmental protection and resource development. And this rule is in furtherance of that commitment that we've all made to engage in a process of continuous improvement so that we can maximize the full benefits both for our environment as well as our economy. The need for this rule, well, there are many. And it has been a long time since the oil and gas regulations surface activities have been updated. In fact, 2001 was the last time this particular provision of the rules had been touched. And indeed, much has changed. The entire statutory regime under which we manage oil and gas activities in Pennsylvania has changed. And there have been significant developments in technology that apply both to conventional as well as unconventional wells, as well as conventional wells, I should point out. Indeed, we have horizontal oil wells being drilled in Pennsylvania for the first time in the history of the program. The other need or purpose of this rule is to fill gaps that have been left behind. And some of these gaps have been filled by other programs within DEP, so we need to acknowledge that within Chapter 78. Some of these gaps have been filled by policy choices, and we feel we need to codify these policy choices so that we have a clear and level playing field for the public to understand, for the industry to understand, and for our own inspectors to understand. But other gaps have been identified and have not been filled. For example, needs identified by an audit conducted by the State Review of Oil and Natural Gas Environmental Regulations. And this rule will rectify that situation. To get here, we have engaged in truly unprecedented amount of public participation. It typically takes 2 years for a regulation to be promulgated in Pennsylvania, and as you can see, the concepts for this rule were first introduced almost five years ago today. And when we released the rulemaking for public comment in December of 2013, we received a huge response. Almost 24,000 comments were received. I'd like to note that in every way possible, the Department of Environmental Protection has gone above and beyond what is called for to engage the public in this rulemaking process. And we have in fact succeeded. As I just noted, over 24,000 comments received on the proposed rulemaking, and then we engaged in an extraordinary second step of offering the rule for a second round of public comment, an additional 45 days, and an additional 3 public hearings. So all told, this rule has been available for public comment for 135 days, 12 public hearings, 20 public meetings on the subject, and the outreach was successful. You can see through the rule that we've carefully considered comments received on the rule and made appropriate changes throughout. And in addition to all of the additional public participation, and as a result of the passage of Act 126 in 2014, and I should also note in response to comments that we received from the conventional oil and gas industry as well as the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, we bifurcated these rules so that it was clear which rules applied to just the conventional oil and gas operators under Chapter 78, as well as the rules that were more tailored to the increases in development brought about by unconventional oil and gas activities. Now, I know the members of this board understand what's affiliated with a rulemaking package, but I know many people throughout Pennsylvania, indeed throughout the country, this may be the first time they've seen our regulatory process and work, so it's important to take just a moment to explain the rulemaking package that the board is considering today. As part of that package, we've developed an executive summary, which, as the name implies, summarizes the changes and the need for those changes. Then we've also developed an order. This is the action that this board will take today to promulgate this rule, and contains the justification and summarization of the regulatory language itself. And that regulatory language is contained in the Annex A when you see this document on our website. We also are required by the Regulatory Review Act to develop a regulatory analysis form, which identifies 30 questions that need to be answered as a justification and demonstration of our consideration of the various interests in developing this rule. And key among that, of course, is an engagement in consideration of small business concerns. And lastly, we've developed a comment and response document showing the careful consideration that the department had for every comment received. This document is approximately 2,500 pages long. And each one of the comments we received, each and every comment received a very detailed and thoughtful response. I'd note that we received comments on all ends of the spectrum on this rulemaking. I would say to come up with a consensus position on these rules really did not appear that it is possible, that if there was a provision in the rule, we received comments that were diametrically opposed to it, essentially. So while we have heard some criticism that we haven't heard from individuals, we haven't been as responsive to their comments, we simply disagree that we have not thoughtfully considered it. We've fully engaged in this process, and sometimes consensus just is not possible, but it is the department's role and responsibility to make the decisions that it believes, based on its experience, based on the data it has at hand, on what is appropriate for reasonable rules that allow for environmentally sound resource development to continue. As part of our consideration of these rules, one of the key issues we needed to consider were costs, and we heard a great deal of comments on the potential costs of this rule. So let me just briefly explain what our assumptions were and what we believe the cost of this rule will be. Importantly, we did not assign costs to aspects of the rule that were not driven by the regulation itself. So one of the, as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the needs for this rule is to fully implement Act 13. So where Act 13 imposed a requirement, we did not believe it was appropriate to attribute the cost of the rule to that legislative mandate. And when we did attribute a cost to a rule, we were accepting the facts and figures provided by the oil and gas industry, frankly. So where they identified costs, for example, to inspect a tank, that it would cost $30 an hour for one of their individuals to inspect a tank, we accepted that, and we assumed that they would be inspecting 175,000 tanks based on, again, on industry data. So with a maximum cost for this rule based on 1,334 conventional wells drilled per year, we believe is about $28.5 million. And the bulk, $27 million of that maximum cost, are attributed to secondary containment around brine tanks when the tank is restored, refurbished, or replaced to a new tank or restored tanks. We are asking operators to put secondary containment around those tanks. That cost alone was estimated to be, by industry, to be approximately $21 million. The cost for inspecting the tanks quarterly was estimated by industry to be a little more than $5 million. And the cost to dispose of or determine the depth of groundwater in a pit that's going to be used to dispose of cuttings and other waste at well sites was estimated by industry to be approximately $1 million. So those provisions alone accounted for over 90% of the total costs. We believe that those costs can be mitigated, and we have taken steps to do so by, for the conventional industry, requiring only quarterly inspections. On the unconventional rules, we're requiring monthly inspections. These quarterly inspections can be done at the same time as their quarterly well integrity inspections, and indeed incorporated into the day-to-day work that operators do at well sites to manage brine at the sites. We are also offering to train the operators to ascertain the depth of fresh groundwater, so they do not need to employ soil scientists. They will be trained by DEP staff to do this work themselves, thus further mitigating costs. For the unconventional rules, again, we're basing this estimate on 1,300 wells drilled. I need to step back. Last year, so for example, we said 1,300 wells for conventional industry. Fewer than 300 conventional wells were drilled this past year, so obviously that cost would be reduced by more than 2/3 as the total impact. The 1,300 wells drilled, that was based on previous years. This past year, fewer than 800 conventional wells were drilled in Pennsylvania. So again, the total costs were we've been very conservative in our numbers, pushing the costs basically to the very upper limits of what we believe will be incurred. But even these costs are inflated based on the fact that fewer wells will in fact be drilled. So out of that maximum annual initial cost of $31 million, and for the first 3 years, we've estimated that the initial cost will be approximately $73 million. The main driver in that maximum cost is the assumption that all of the centralized impoundments in Pennsylvania will in fact be decommissioned rather than permitted under our residual waste rules. The other costs that we accepted from the industry were the development of freshwater impoundments. We assumed that these freshwater impoundments do not have liners in them, do not have fences around them. If you go to Pennsylvania shale fields, you'll see that in fact they typically do, but we wanted to be conservative, and so we overestimated the cost of complying with that rule. And the last two costs for reviewing the area around which wells will be hydraulically fractured. Again, we heard many operators do this work already, but we assumed that it was not in fact being done, and therefore that area of review would be attributed a little more than $11 million. And Vandal-Proofing Tanks, again accepting industry estimates, would cost between $3 and $4.5 million. So that's the process by which we've arrived at this point, the considerations we've undertaken. Now let's get into the substance of the rule itself, and I'll also add where the justification and need for each of these provisions are along the way. And fundamentally, this rule is about improving environmental performance in Pennsylvania so we can assure our citizens that the air, land, and water that benefits us all is adequately protected during well development activities. And as we engaged in finalizing this rule, I mentioned before that we engaged in this advance notice of final rulemaking process, which is completely voluntary and actually little used. And that process also worked. As a proposed rule, we had identified two provisions we thought were important: regulation of noise and establishing centralized tank storage standards. But then, based on comments received by both the public and the industry, we felt that it was prudent to remove both of those provisions. So again, demonstrating our commitment to working with stakeholders to craft rules that enable responsible drilling to occur. One of the key criticisms we've heard throughout this process is that we've treated the conventional industry identically to the unconventional industry. And indeed, there are provisions of this rule where we felt that the activities of both industries had similar impacts on the environment, and some of these were also identified by the legislature. So we did feel that there were times when rules need to be applied to the conventional industry in the same manner as the unconventional industry. And one of those areas is where well sites are built close proximity to streams and wetlands. And in those instances, we feel that it is appropriate for the department to review the erosion and sediment control plans, the preparedness and prevention and contingency plans, and other plans to ensure that our water resources are protected during site construction. Other areas where we felt that the industry should be treated similarly is just in the permitting process. So for the first time, we're allowing permit renewals to stand for 2 years rather than just 1 year for both industries. And as you go through the sections on public resources, you'll see we made a number of changes, but that was simply there to clarify the rule. And public resource protection is really one of the more significant areas of this rule. It was brought about by changes to Act 13, which authorized the department to develop regulations to better protect public resources in areas that are, quite frankly, outside the normal scope of the department's main focus, so areas like recreation and aesthetics. This is simply a screening process. It is not a setback where when well sites or access roads are within prescribed distances from resources like parks and forests, historic places, and we also added schools, playgrounds, and wellhead protection zones, that the industry should engage the party responsible for managing these resources to better mitigate the potential impacts that could occur. After that consultation process, the comments of the jurisdictional agency, if you will, as well as the plans by the operator will be submitted to the department for consideration, where we may impose permit conditions to better protect those public resources. A second area where we added similar, identical provisions to both the conventional and unconventional industry is what we call an area of review. And this is an area where we prescribe a distance around which operators need to identify active or abandoned wells that could be impacted by the hydraulic fracturing process. When we were audited by the State Review of Oil and Natural Gas Environmental Regulations, they identified this as an area of deficiency within our program. Stronger is a multi-stakeholder organization that consists of state regulators, industry, and non-governmental organizations. And they develop guidelines which are designed to identify minimally acceptable standards for any oil and gas program across the country. And this is an area where we had, quite frankly, a gaping hole in our regulatory process. And we believe, based on past incidents where wells have been fracked into during that process, as well as the thoughtful consideration by that organization, that this is an appropriate change to make. Water supply restoration standards is another significant aspect of this rule, and it was in fact brought about by changes to Act 13. When Act 13 was amended, the legislature determined that restored water supplies or replaced water supplies that have been affected by oil and gas development should be restored to the better of pre-drill conditions or Safe Drinking Water Act standards. We are incorporating that interpretation into this rule, and it is applicable to both conventional and unconventional industries. The fourth significant area of change that we believe was applicable to both industries is spill reporting and cleanup. A barrel of diesel fuel has the same impact on a conventional site when spilled as it does on an unconventional site, and therefore we believe that these industries need to be treated similarly when these environmental threats occur. We also believe that the oil and gas industry should be treated like every other industry in Pennsylvania when it comes to cleaning up spills to a scientifically based standard, and that is our Act 2 program. These rules are important for clarifying these spill reporting thresholds, as well as ensuring that the site is properly remediated to a scientific based standard. And lastly, we felt that the use of centralized impoundments should not distinguish between the two industries. Frankly, I'm not aware of the conventional industry utilizing centralized impoundments to service multiple sites, but as I noted in the beginning, we were starting to see things like horizontal oil wells being developed. They have very similar characteristics to shale gas development in the volumes of water used and the footprint of the site, so it was conceivable that centralized impoundments could be pursued. We believe that these large waste management facilities ought to be regulated as other waste facilities are throughout the Commonwealth, and that is pursuant to our residual waste regulations. So those are the similarities between the two, Chapter 78 and 78A. And let's take some time now talking about what the differences are. And I would note that one of the defining characteristics of the differences is that if there is ever a rule that treats the industry as a whole more stringently, it occurs on the unconventional side of the ledger. And one of those areas is Vandal-Proofing Tanks. The unconventional industry has actually been subject to acts beyond just mere vandalism and actually approaching eco-terrorism, where we've found exploded and unexploded homemade bombs on these sites. We believe that it's reasonable to take prudent measures to deflect the casual vandal, but we heard from the conventional industry that the costs associated with doing this work would be exorbitant, and their sites were not really the subject of this kind of activity compared to the unconventional sites, so we differentiated between the two industries. Use of pits is another area where we've taken a major stride. When we proposed this rule, the number one comment we received from the public is to eliminate pits at unconventional sites. And our experience with pits at these sites confirmed that this indeed is a necessary change. The duration at which a pit could be used in an unconventional site could span years, and the volumes of fluid stored were substantial. Between human error, improper construction, and even wildlife, we've had any number of instances with leaking pits that have caused significant environmental damage. Our experience with unconventional pits is not the same. That the impact, that they're a shorter-lived pit. If there is a release, it's a much smaller volume, and therefore we did not choose to eliminate pits or change the regulations on conventional pits at all. The volumes of cuttings and other waste generated at an unconventional well site is probably several orders of magnitude larger than at a conventional site. While we retained the permit by rule provisions for waste management at conventional sites, unconventional sites will require an individual permit if they wish to dispose of their cuttings at these sites. I will say that this is currently a practice not engaged in by the conventional industry. They are landfilling these wastes, but we felt it was prudent to make sure that higher standard that is set became the permanent norm throughout the Commonwealth. Secondary containment was a provision, a very bold provision within Act 13. So when you go to unconventional sites today, you will see that they are completely lined during the drilling and fracking process. Candidly, if this rule was finalized when it was first proposed, I don't know that this provision would have been in there. The technologies, the materials at the time just did not exist. But between the department's insistence and the industry's insistence on higher standards, Act 13 was amended to require this, and we're codifying that change in our regulations to provide greater specificity. As the Secretary's Pipeline Infrastructure Task Force is evidence, gathering line development in Pennsylvania is occurring at an unprecedented rate. And some of the issues associated with gathering line development in the unconventional industry just don't occur with the smaller gathering lines that the conventionals may use. We identified areas like topsoil preservation as well as further protections for wetlands and endangered species as needed rule changes to ensure that the lasting footprint of gathering lines is minimized to the best extent possible. Other pipelines being utilized are to eliminate truck traffic by moving waste fluids as well as fresh water from site to site. The unconventional rules contain provisions that would require these truly temporary lines to be located above ground so that they can be inspected and effectively drained when not in use. We do not have a provision similar to this in Chapter 78 for the conventional industry. Water management plans is another section that was added by Act 13. Obviously, the large volumes of water being withdrawn from Pennsylvania's headwaters and smaller streams has a great potential to impair these streams and rivers. The legislature correctly saw fit to require unconventional operators to get an approval from the department before they engage in these water withdrawals, so we could assure ourselves that Pennsylvania streams and rivers, the quality of it is maintained and protected. Beneficial use of brine is another section where there is a difference between the two industries. Conventional brines have been utilized probably since the first well was drilled as a dust suppressant throughout Pennsylvania. It has been authorized under a fact sheet. We believe that it is more appropriate to have that practice codified under rule, but we also know that unconventional brines change in quality over time, and there has not been an appropriate chemical characterization of these fluids done to the extent that we could say that it can be safely used on Pennsylvania roads. The last change I'd like to point out is the reporting of wastes. That requirement has changed over time. Traditionally, wastes were reported to the department annually. Then the rules were changed so that waste would need to be reported every 6 months. We have done some analysis of these reports by not just what the drillers report, but also what the waste facilities receive, and have noted that they are routinely disparate. And we are concerned that waiting 6 months to find that information out is not appropriate. So we want to get this information in more quickly. We've aligned the reporting requirements between the generators and the treatment and disposal facilities, and this will enable us to ensure the public that these wastes are in fact being managed in an environmentally protective way. Again, it's almost 5 years into this process, and I know that everyone in this room has been very engaged with the department throughout. And we certainly appreciate your work, and I know that it has made these rules better. But we believe that it is appropriate for the Environmental Quality Board to approve these regulations as proposed, and we request that you do so today.
I want to recognize Representative Marr, who arrived. Glad you made it. We will next hear a presentation from the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee. They will be given 10 minutes to make their presentation.
Dear honorable members of the Environmental Quality Board, my name is David Oakes. I'm a geologist for a conventional oil and gas production company located in Clarion, Pennsylvania. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today on behalf of the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee, COJAC. My testimony will focus on concerns regarding the proposed changes to PA Code Title 25, Chapter 78, Subchapter C for conventional oil and gas wells. I begin by sharing some statistics on conventional well development. Within the Commonwealth derived from DEP data, from 2008, the year that the Marcellus Shale began to take off, through the end of 2015, the number of drilled conventional wells decreased by 94%. The number of well permit applications decreased by 95% over the same period of time, indicating that new conventional well development is a shadow of its former self. The introduction of Act 13 and promulgation of new Chapter 78 regulations are a result of new and different challenges associated with the development of the Marcellus Shale and other emerging unconventional oil and gas plays within the Appalachian Basin. I ask, prior to the unconventional boom, was there a need or was action being taken to revamp Chapter 78 for conventional operations? Was the conventional oil and gas industry considered to be adequately regulated prior to the Marcellus? These key questions are required to be addressed at the beginning of the rulemaking process. The Regulatory Review Act requires the publication of a Regulatory Analysis Form, RAF, at the same time the regulation is first published. The RAF must include the foundational components of a rule, a statement of need, the financial analysis of the regulatory costs, relied upon data, the analysis of alternatives for small business, and the provision of forms required by the proposed regulations. The proposed rule was published in December 2013, and the accompanying RAF did not contain these required items for conventional oil and gas. As detailed in our written comments, the statement of need is lacking. The majority of regulatory sections did not receive a financial analysis. No data was relied upon, no alternatives for small business were analyzed, and none of the requisite forms were provided. The fact that the initial RAF was inadequate is demonstrated by the length and content of the RAF published on January 6th of 2016 in association with the final rule. The original RAF contained 29 pages, only a few of which pertain to conventional oil and gas. The new RAF, which is a combined form in spite of the separate rule for conventional oil and gas, is 192 pages, a six-fold increase. The new RAF contains revised cost estimates for new requirements in the final rule, but the department regularly disagrees with cost estimates provided by industry and regularly assigns zero cost to what it calls existing requirements. The new RAF demonstrates that the department has failed to provide less stringent regulations for small businesses and only points to differences that are either required by Act 13 or are entirely justified by the nature of conventional operations, which are all significantly different than unconventional operations. And the new RAF refers to 29 new forms that will be required but have not been provided for review. In the 2013 RAF, the department noted that data was not the basis for the proposed rule. The new RAF provides a variety of data which cannot now be evaluated to determine if it's acceptable data as defined in the RRA. As one example, a communication study that is meant to justify the area of review obligations considers 2 communication instances involving conventional operations. If the department had provided this study in 2013, a useful discussion could have been undertaken regarding its significance, validity, and reliability. No such review or discussion can be conducted now that the rule is final. The RRA requires key steps at the beginning of the process, so the regulations are developed in a manner that avoids hidden costs and excess regulation. The Oil and Gas Act requires regulations that allow the optimal development of oil and gas resources. Because these key steps did not occur, the proposed regulations overreach, which is needed to protect the environment. The overreach is so distinct that the program will unnecessarily discourage conventional oil and gas production rather than encourage the optimal development of Pennsylvania's conventional oil and gas resources. In addition, failure to achieve these key steps at the beginning of the process made it impossible to carry on an informed dialogue about need, costs, alternatives, and the like during the required comment process. Act 126 of 2014 required promulgation of separate regulations for Pennsylvania's conventional oil and gas industry. In April 2015, the DEP published an advance notice of final rulemaking, ANFR. The April 2015 ANFR for the first time published separate regulations for Pennsylvania's conventional oil and gas industry. However, the separate conventional regulations were a selective cutting and pasting of material from the original December 14, 2013 publication. Most important, even when the separate regulations were published in the April 2015 ANFR, there were no simultaneous publication of a separate RAF analyzing the need, cost, or other topics addressed in the RRA and which relate to Pennsylvania's conventional oil and gas industry. Additionally, the ANFR introduced significant additions and revisions to the proposed rule without explanation, without a revision to the RAF, and without describing the rationale for changes made in response to previous comments from the public, the IRRC, the legislative committees, or other sources. Thus, as COJAC examined the specific provisions of the proposed and now final rule, COJAC has been able to gather a firm understanding of the breadth of the proposed rule because the required forms are not available. COJAC has been able to completely comment on alternatives for small business because the statement of need for the proposed regulations was not available and because the RAF is devoid of any such alternatives. In general, COJAC was not able to determine if the substance of the proposed revision is appropriate because the information that would have been derived therefrom, such as the need or required forms, is unavailable. In those instances, the substance of the regulation is also flawed because it's impossible to know if the proposed regulation achieves the legislative purpose. With that caution stated, COJAC offers these specific substantive comments. Section 7851, Protection of Water Supplies. This aspect of the final rule would create an unreasonable burden for the operator to potentially restore an impacted water supply to a level better than what existed prior to drilling. After more than 2 years of development, the Department has acknowledged that the technical feasibility and financial obligation of this requirement are unknown and will not be known until guidance documents are promulgated. Further, the Department is imposing standards for the replacement of water supplies that are unregulated, have no construction standards, and are not subject to state or federal water quality standards. Section 7852A and 7873, Area of Review. The extent of the burden, including compliance costs, is unknown until the technical guidance document and associated forms are created. Although guidance documents are not yet issued, comments by DEP staff at COJAC meetings and the revised language of the final rules suggest under this section the DEP could disallow completion of a new well, thus elevating this section to a new permitting provision. DEP informed COJAC that the area review is not a mandate of Act 13, but has been developed in response to stronger guidelines and recommendations. The stronger assessment of 2013 specifically addresses the importance of identifying orphaned and abandoned wells within a prescribed distance before hydraulically fracturing a well, but their assessment does not call for the identification of other well classifications, a report, a monitoring program, or a landowner questionnaire. Without any of these items mentioned, Stronger's review of 2013 found that the abandoned site program at that time met or exceeded the stronger guidelines. 7866, Spills and Releases. The final rule would inappropriately apply provisions to the Pennsylvania Land Recycling Program, Act 2, to minor spill investigations and cleanup, and in so doing would violate the intent of the program established in 1995 to be a voluntary program to encourage the reuse of blighted lands. Further, the final rule would establish spill threshold values for brine that are many times more stringent than more toxic hazardous substances. While the department may view brine as being more toxic than many listed hazardous substances in the Commonwealth, COJAC does not share this view and believes this section fails to meet the requisite legislative balance. The final rule requires oil and gas operators to comply with Act 2 remediation for spills. and that program is voluntary for other entities and industries, including manufacturing, power generation, chemical facilities, and more. Kojak suggests that the existing rule be maintained for conventional operations. Forms. More than 24 forms are referenced in the proposed rule that have not been made available for review and comment prior to drafting of the final rule. The failure to provide forms in a timely manner for public comment is inappropriate and contrary to the Regulatory Review Act. Additional substantive comments are discussed in the Kojak report submitted to the EQB. Kojak recognizes the need for and welcomes a robust oil and gas regulatory program in Pennsylvania. However, we must continue our effort to ensure that the regulations do not overreach what is needed to protect the environment and public health, and that the ability to optimize development of conventional oil and gas resources is maintained. Kojak asked the Environmental Quality Board to vote no to this conventional oil and gas rule. As evidenced by the drastic decrease in conventional well activity, it's clear that the industry is struggling, to say the least. However, this downturn has provided us with an opportunity to take a step back, look at the facts, examine the needs, and if necessary, develop or modify regulations that make sense and that achieve the desired balance of environmental protection and optimized development of conventional oil and gas resources. The members of Kojak welcome the opportunity to help achieve that goal. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you. Next, we will hear a 10-minute presentation from the Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Committee.
Secretary Quigley, members of the Environmental Quality Board, thank you for allowing me to be here. My name is Brian McConnell. I am the chairman of the Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Board. Again, I want to acknowledge all of the hard work and effort that has gone into preparing and making this proposed environmental regulatory package. As Deputy Secretary Perry has stated, I know that there were long hours, many weekends, often nights and holidays that were sacrificed in order to put this package together, and that is certainly appreciated by the members of the Technical Advisory Board. Along with that, the advisory board spent a reasonable amount of time reviewing the changes, and more so to the advanced notice of final rulemaking. But little time was spent at TAB working on the conventional oil and gas rules, and we greatly relied upon the conventional oil and gas technical Oil and Gas Committee to provide input to TAB along with to those that rulemaking package. In a perfect world, TAB would have had an opportunity to participate in work groups and had one-on-one discussions with agency staff and people that had input into in the rulemaking package. But with TAB being appointed in April of 2015, it didn't allow us that opportunity to go through the 4-year process that preceded the appointment of the TAB members. But with a steep learning curve, we were able to, I believe, manage to come up to the task of providing some insightful comments to the regulations. We afforded some changes and worked closely with the department to have a good, robust discussion with regard to the regulations. TAB believes that there is still some work that remains to be done on the regulations. There are some important issues that are outstanding from the previous TAB's report to the Environmental Quality Board, which was included in our report as Attachment A and Attachment B. The Conventional Oil and Gas Committee's report to the Environmental Quality Board was attachment C to our report, and we included that. And along with our advisors to the Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Board, we provided their comments in our report as attachment D. Some of those critical features that we think that deserve some additional attention and perhaps discussion are 7815 F and G, other critical communities. There's a with the Robinson Township case and a recent decision by the Commonwealth Court on December 29th, we recommended that another look be taken at those critical communities. As Mr. Oakes had pointed out, protection of water supplies, that's a very technical subject, and to get into the weeds in the regulation with it is a difficult thing to do, and it deserves a guidance manual that needs to be put out there so that everyone knows which way to function in the protection of these water resources. This is critical to the viability of any environmental program within the Commonwealth or in the nation for that matter. And we've seen, recently we've seen lead contamination in the state of Michigan, and we certainly understand from that activity, we understand how important our water resources are here within the Commonwealth, and we want to be very protective and be responsible for that activity. The area of review also looks that we will need to have some additional workings on that. Again, it's technical guidance that needs to be developed in order to have everybody working from the same sheet of music. And again, as Mr. Oakes had pointed out, the disposal of production fluids and so forth. In 78A 61, disposal of drill cuttings. We think that there's a lot of good practices that have been developed in the last 5 years or so that we've been doing things, and we think that the department is actually moving in a good direction in that regard. Site restoration, again, needs, there's some issues there that need to be worked out, and we need to continue to have discussions regarding those. TAB recommended the following 6 items in our report that we would like EQB to consider prior to finalizing the regulatory package. And that was the reconsideration of the inclusion of critical communities, technical guidance development for the enactment of 78A 51, protection of water supplies, consultation with TAB prior to implementation of forms, and that activity has actually started to occur. Changes to site restoration, protection of water supplies, and time to allow the regulated community to adjust and comply with these new requirements, and provide needed training for not only department staff, but as industry as well for the implementation of these regulations. Again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you and for allowing the Technical Advisory Board to participate in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. All right, at this time, the board members will have the opportunity to ask questions of the Department of Environmental Protection if they need clarification about any of the provisions in the final rulemaking. So are there any questions for Scott, Liz, or Kurt? Bert.
We all know that certain sections of Act 13 have been declared unconstitutional. More specifically, Section 3215C was identified as being inappropriate. Why does the department believe now that Section 7815 of the proposed regs will not be viewed in a similar manner if they're challenged in the future?
And Bert, I believe you're speaking to the area of review for well pads that are within 100 feet of streams and wetlands. Is that correct?
And other public resources.
And other public resources. Well, first, we certainly acknowledge that the hard setback that Act 13 had in it from well sites and wells from streams and wetlands was indeed invalidated by the Supreme Court. But we still have an obligation under our Clean Streams Law to ensure that our water resources are adequately maintained and protected during development activities. And as the department developed its riparian buffer rules under Chapter 102, we worked with the Stroud Center in developing like a scientific basis for that. And as it turns out, a 100-foot setback actually eliminates over 80% of potential impacts from erosion just by having that riparian buffer in place. Now, this is not establishing a setback because we acknowledge that the law was struck down in that regard, and we don't think that we have the authority to just create setbacks. But what we did feel was appropriate was to have basically an heightened review of sites that are going to be in close proximity to resources that could be negatively affected during development activities, and that is basically a review of permits or plans or permits that are already otherwise required. So I felt like that was a reasonable step. With respect to the other provisions of 7815 for protecting public resources, we actually do not believe that provision was struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stated that it would be struck down to the extent it implemented the setback requirements for streams and wetlands, and of course it does not. We are certainly aware of the industry's disagreement with that, where it's being litigated in front of the Commonwealth Court. That court has not ruled on the validity of that section. It has only ruled that the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association has standing to sue the department. We intend to go through that process. And we also believe that the department has much broader authorities to support greater protection of public resources than just Act 13. We administer a number of different statutes: Clean Streams Law, the Dam Safety Encroachment Act, the Solid Waste Management Act, and others, as well, of course, as Article 1, Section 27 of the Constitution, that would justify greater protections of public resources. And so we will go through the process within the Commonwealth Court and perhaps the Supreme Court. And the decisions on the efficacy of the rule will be decided at the conclusion of those proceedings.
Thank you, sir.
Other questions? Senator.
Mr. Secretary, I'll tell you what my question is, and then I'll give you the background as to where I get to the question. And my question is this, why are we going forward with these regulations now? And what leads to that question is this: in July of 2013, in a document that TAB sent to the EQB, it was stated that the proposed regulation does not meet the requirements of the Executive Order 1966-1 or departmental policy, which requires rules to address compelling public interest in a manner by which the costs do not outweigh the benefits. The same thing was sent to you in another document on March 11, 2014. TAB reconfirmed their standard of saying the proposed regulations do not meet that standard of compelling interest in a cost-effective manner. Now, I understand this is Harrisburg, and that was a different administration. But in March of 2015, the governor dismissed, or all of the members of the TAB board were dismissed and replaced. And at the same time, COJAC was created with members of, I assume, the administration's choosing. Now, in the document that TAB filed on January the 6th, 2016, TAB and Mr. McConnell doesn't give you glowing reports about cooperating with them as far as providing information. And in fact, there are many places they say they were not provided information to assist in making a decision. They also incorporate the COJAC resolution from October 29th, I think it is, 2015, which is part of this January the 6th, 2016 report. And it specifically says DEP should not move the regulatory package to the EQB for the reasons stated above. Many of them are the fact that it does not meet the compelling interest. And I also noticed that in your testimony, not one time did you use the word compelling interest, not once. You used needs, assumptions, not aware of a problem. You did not use compelling interest. My question is, in light of the fact that many of the other entities around this table, I'm sure, solicit advisory committee information, I do, but if you have two advisory boards, which you appointed, basically, and they both say don't do it, or at least are lukewarm, my question is, why are we here?
Well, that's a very fair point, and I was remiss in not identifying the compelling need to have water supplies that are polluted by oil and gas activities be restored or replaced, the compelling need for spills that can have very deleterious effects on our environment to be reported and cleaned up, the compelling need identified by the legislature to further protect public resources. When we look through the list that was just provided to us by Mr. Oaks and Mr. McConnell, I and my staff basically struggle to understand why we shouldn't have appropriate standards for cleaning up polluted water supplies, why we shouldn't attempt to identify wells that, if you frack into it, can pollute groundwater, can jeopardize public safety through methane migration that costs literally millions of dollars to clean up when it does happen. I'm even aware of one situation where we had rolling brownouts in Pittsburgh because a fracked into conventional well actually took out a high voltage transmission line in the process. So obviously, if that was providing power to hospitals, it could have had direct threat to public safety. So there is a disagreement between the department and our advisory committees on some of these points. And two of the points with respect to water supply restoration and public resource protection was in fact a judgment of the legislature that these are things that are important for Pennsylvania's regulatory program. The two areas where we ourselves created rules that were on our own motion, so to speak, is this area of review where you can frack into abandoned or active wells. And although that does not happen frequently, this is a situation where one time is one time too many, we believe, and the cost of cleanup and the potential threat to public safety warrant it. The other is to report and clean up spills. Since 2001, the standard for reporting a spill in Pennsylvania for brine has been 5 gallons over a 24-hour period. And we agree with the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee that brine is not a tremendously harmful substance. Few things at a well site that are spilled are less harmful than brine. And since it was the judgment of the board, of the department since 2001, that something as innocuous as 5 gallons of brine should be reported to the department, we felt it was prudent to apply that standard to all regulated substances that could be spilled. And when it comes to cleaning up spills, although when you are cleaning up a polluted brownfield site, it is a voluntary process in Pennsylvania. You can take your time to clean those things up. But when somebody intentionally or accidentally spills something today, whether it's a truck driver, whether it's my home heating oil tank, whether it's Dow Chemicals petrochemical facility, they have to clean it up to an Act 2 standard. That is not a voluntary program in that regard. The department would mandate that those spills be cleaned up to a scientifically sound standard. And frankly, the oil and gas industry was not being held to that standard, was not being held to that cleanup standard for many years, and these rules are rectifying it. With respect to reconstituting the Technical Advisory Board and the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee, it is a good idea. The board that we had while we were developing these rules did not have the expertise to provide us with the guidance that we needed on unconventional development. And it would not be fair to load up a board with only folks that drill unconventional wells when we're also charged with managing the conventional oil and gas industry. We asked for recommendations on who to put on the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee, and we accepted every single recommendation from folks like Senator Hutchinson to have members of the Pennsylvania Grade Crude Coalition on that board, Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association on the board, and the Pennsylvania Independent Petroleum Producers on the board. So we stacked the deck against us on that board. And Burt Waite, of course, who has been involved in the process from the very, very beginning, actually involved in the process since before I started working with the department, is also on that board representing the Citizens Advisory Committee. So we wanted to get fair and unvarnished advice, and we certainly get that from Kojak, but we also needed extremely technical advice on some of the well development practices that the unconventional group engaged in. And indeed, even a few years before we did this move, the Marcellus Shale Coalition and other groups approached the department about replacing, getting new members on the advisory board, but for one reason or another, that did not happen. And it felt like that we were at a critical juncture with the advance notice of final rulemaking, and we needed to have this broader view applied to the rulemaking. And so we as a whole, the department as a whole, felt that there was a compelling interest in having fresh voices and very specific voices on these advisory committees. Unfortunately, we could not reach consensus on all of these issues, but we feel like we have done a reasonable job of tailoring the rules to meet the needs that we've identified.
My only comment is, you've given a very long answer as to why three bodies, one under the prior administration recommended no, and your own people recommend at least lukewarm to this whole revision, and one of your advisory bodies says don't do it. I'm not sure why we have advisory bodies, and you've said how great they are, but clearly you're not going to listen to them, or you don't want to listen to them.
Well, the rule itself is a direct result of an incredible amount of engagement with those both the previous tab members as well as the current members and other members of the industry. When we first put out some examples, when we first put out the rule, the Vandal-Proofing Tanks, the gathering line provisions, and the horizontal directional drilling rules that are all on the unconventional side of the regulation were all in Chapter 78, that we were going to apply that to the conventional industry. And we heard the concerns from those folks, from our advisory committee, and we took it out. When you do side-by-side comparing the conventional Chapter 78 to 78A, other than codifying policies like site restoration and effectuating statutory mandates, that area of review and spill cleanup and reporting are the only two things that are new to that industry. And both of the conventional industry is actually more likely to frack into abandoned and active wells than the unconventional industry, because they're still drilling and fracking in the same formations as in the past. So we definitely believe we have a compelling need for those provisions. We do listen to our advisory committees. The great change that occurred from proposed to now is evidence of that. But on some provisions, it's our job to basically call the ball or the strike. And certainly the public comments we received on this, if we took those as a whole and only followed the public comments, we'd be enacting a moratorium or banning all pits everywhere. But we didn't do that. We based our decisions on our judgment, our experience, and it is substantial. We see all operators across all spectrums and understand what the potential risks of oil and gas development are on Pennsylvania. And I truly believe, Senator, that we have taken incremental and appropriate steps in this rule, but we will just have to agree to disagree on things like how well a water supply needs to be restored, and again, based on guidance provided by the legislature.
please understand, I am not against environmental regulation. My touchstone is this: anything we do has to be reasonable, rational, and responsible. And I'm not sure that we're meeting that standard.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Madam Chair.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Good morning to Scott and his staff, and a thank you to them as well, because in my deliberation and consideration of these regulations, I was able to sit down and talk with them, as well as Commissioner Whitmer, who serves as my alternate on this board, just to get some additional information. And what I want to bring to the board today is just some comments that I received from some of my commissioners, but also I have a question as well. I think some of the comments are just the general ones you've already heard, but I wanted to make sure that you hear some of our concerns, and that was more of the consideration of additional information, as we talked about, or as other people already testified, in terms of like public resources, the concern that there has been some expansion of public resources, and also whether or not that is able to be done under advance notice of final rulemaking, the concern that it was additional information that was not done there before. I've also heard some concern in terms of the separate promulgation of the regulations, as someone has already testified in terms of Act 126, whether or not the legislature meant for having a separate promulgation in terms of a separate package that would come through instead of a Chapter 78 and a Chapter 78A. But in looking at that, those are just some of the concerns that I have received. But the general consensus from my commissioners is that we respect what the DEP is trying to do and defer to their expertise in this rulemaking. We looked at it, or I looked at it, and I recommended to my colleagues in terms of our focus at the Public Utility Commission to look at it in terms of our mission and what we do in terms of regulated utilities. And in discussing with Scott, I asked that direct question, that I don't think that these impact the water companies that we regulate in terms of their certificate of public convenience, in terms of fresh water, sale of that to the consumers. And I don't believe that it does. But my question to Scott, and my question again today here, is did we receive any comments from any of our water companies that we regulate? And I don't believe that there have been any comments. So that was my question and some of the concerns I wanted to put on the record.
Thank you. Other questions? Representative.
Process question, Mr. Chairman. Senator Yaw, Senator Udachak, and I have each circulated amendments we'd like to have considered. In terms of how you intend to proceed today, we'll be proceeding with the amendments and then considering the regulation as amended, or is it just the nature of comments is going to be very different if we're able to do some of these fine-tunings than it would be otherwise. So I might suggest that we move into the amendments and then have a discussion on whatever results.
Well, that will be a decision that the board will make, Representative. What we had said, and this was prior to your arrival, we laid out the agenda here, and the idea was for any member of the board to have an opportunity to answer or ask any questions of DEP before we put the regulation before the board for consideration. And at that point, we'll get into the amendment discussion. So are there any other questions from the board? All right. I am seeing none. Going once, going twice. Okay. So we will now proceed with consideration of the rulemaking. And in order to tee this up for discussion, do I have a motion to approve Chapter 78 and Chapter 78A final rulemaking as presented and recommended by the Department of Environmental Protection? Do I have a second? Okay, it's been properly moved and second. Now we come to the discussion, and I would call on Mr. Arway, who made the original motion, for the first comment.
Thank you, Secretary Quigley, and good morning, members of the board. I would come here today and to speak in favor of the need for these regulations from two perspectives. One is a professional scientific perspective, and the other is a personal perspective. My career spans over 35 years with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I began it back in the early 1980s as a member of the Governor's Oil and Gas Environmental Advisory Committee. And at that time, the governor saw fit, and I can't remember if it was the end of the Governor Thornburg administration or the beginning of the Governor Casey administration, which spans that decade, but it was one of those two governors that decided to put together a team of experts to talk about new regulation, new law, disposal of brine, control of erosion and sedimentation, similar issues that we're still talking about today. And at the time, we only had conventional oil and gas drilling. We had primary, secondary, and tertiary development. We didn't have unconventional oil and gas drilling at the time. So our focus was on that. And I became oriented to the issues that we continue to talk about today through that process. As a fisheries biologist, I went out into the oil and gas fields in the middle 1980s when EPA came into Pennsylvania and declared it a major oil spill. They brought in the Coast Guard, the Atlantic Strike Force team, and the Gulf Strike Force team, and we worked with them to walk the watersheds of northwestern Pennsylvania to identify sources of both oil and brine in the surface waters and groundwaters of Pennsylvania. I turned over that database of information to Deputy Secretary Perry a couple months ago, which still exists today, and I can guarantee you a lot of those abandoned pits and still active pits are still part of that inventory that we accumulated back in the mid-1980s. And they still employ the same practices that they did back then, too. We identified, again, both sources of active and abandoned discharges, and EPA spent a lot of federal money coming in and cleaning up some of those sources of oil. Fortunately, our oils are paraffinic in Pennsylvania. They don't go very far once they get in the soil, so they're pretty easy cleanups. But they weren't interested in the brine, and the brine mobilizes and goes through soils in the groundwater into the streams, which was the source of our investigations back at the time. And I actually discovered water in the headwaters of some of our trout streams that were saltier than the Atlantic Ocean, over 42% salinity in the headwaters of some of our freshwater streams. We also sampled water and fish throughout northwestern Pennsylvania and found contaminants in fish tissue, aliphatic and aromatic hydrocarbons, that made them unpalatable for people to eat. I actually tried to eat some of those fish myself, and I couldn't eat them because they tasted like oil. Those fish still exist in our watersheds throughout northwestern Pennsylvania because of the residual contamination that still flows either out of the ground or into the surface waters that we have. So our role as an agency was to help get EPA organized, do the assessment, and then work with the department through the Oil and Gas Environmental Advisory Committee to develop a set of rules and regulations that hopefully would control some of these discharges into the future. It was not very successful, and I say that only because I'll give you a personal observation in a minute about what we may have found or what may occur today. We sampled, I took the Citizens Advisory Council on a tour of Pittle Creek back in the mid-'80s. Cynthia, I don't know if you were on the council at the time, but Gail Rockwood and John Oliver were there. And we made them witnesses to a criminal investigation. We collected water quality from a discharge. It was a pit discharge from a primary oil well going into Pittle Creek, and actually took that through successful prosecution. Some on the council at the time were appalled that they were witnesses to a criminal activity. But the reality of it is there was criminal activity that was going on and still goes on in the oil and gas fields. I've been an expert witness in federal court with the Department of Justice and EPA on some major waterflood discharges. I've testified in both Commonwealth Court and civil and administrative courts throughout the state about the toxicity of oil and gas brines and oil on fish. So I come to you with some expertise in talking about this issue. Now that I'm director, I can focus on public policy issues a little more directly than on the science. I've also given talks at major conferences around the country throughout my career and published in the scientific literature about the effects of these substances on fish and aquatic life that live in our state. I'd be happy to share those technical presentations and papers with you if you'd like. From a personal perspective, we have a family cottage in the middle of the Allegheny National Forest in the middle of the shallow oil fields, and I grew up there. I began visiting that cottage back in 1958, and I now own it. It's a typical hunting and fishing camp in northwestern Pennsylvania, and our visits to the National Forest was part of my history. And you know, we grew up around knowing that we only have one Class A trout stream in Forest County. Now that's pretty pretty disconcerting from a director of the Fish and Boat Commission, only because Forest County is only our third least populous county in the state, and you would expect, based upon the environmental conditions in Forest County, that we could support more fish in those streams. The trouble is the cumulative impact of oil and gas development have caught up and impacted those streams in Forest County so that we don't have Class A wild trout streams there. About 10 years ago, and these aren't historical impacts, these are local and recent impacts. About 10 years ago, there was a new oil well development above the mountain that was drilled back right after, it was the first large-scale oil development drilled after Drake drilled the first well in Titusville. It was, it's called Cooper Track. And there was actually a village and thousands of wells that were drilled on that hillside. About 10 years ago, a new oil and gas developer came in and drilled new wells into that same formation, fracked those wells, and they came out of several abandoned wells down gradient of those new wells that they drilled, and hydraulic pressures forced brine and oil back to the surface and contaminated 3 water supplies to 3 camps along the hillside just down the road from my camp. The oil and gas developer went bankrupt. However, he left behind those contaminated springs that hopefully these regulations won't allow happen into the future. So from a personal and professional perspective, I speak in favor of these regulations and the need for them. They're long overdue. And I ask that my fellow board members vote with me today to support the department's recommendations for the amendments to Chapter 78 and 78A. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
On the question. Bert.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not sure of the proper procedure here, but I'd like to make a motion, or I'd like to discuss the concept that's considering 78 and 78A separately. And my rationale for that is that was asked for in Act 126 to view these as separate regulations. And second, and in my mind just as important, is to afford the more flexibility, more options for the members of this board to approve or disapprove the conventional and or the unconventional regulations.
I want to see if I can get this straight here, but what you're suggesting is that we separate the rule for consideration. So is your motion that we amend, we have a motion on the floor to approve the rule. So is your motion to amend that motion to consider 78 and 78A separately?
Yes, sir.
Right. Do we have a second on that motion? Seconded by Representative Moore. All those in favor of this motion, please, on the question. Go ahead, on the question.
I think it might be an elegant solution to a lingering problem. The legislature directed in statute, it was enacted by a governor into law, that there should be separate rulemaking dealing with conventional from that dealing with unconventional. And I've got considerable concerns that has been disregarded to this point. This motion would at least allow the EQB to have a bit of a straight face and say that it did in fact promulgate regulations separately. It's not much of a Band-Aid, but it's something. Otherwise, I think we've got a real problem that the whole thing will disappear in the courts.
Representative Vitale.
I mean, I'm going to oppose this. I've seen nothing over the past number of years other than the endless attempt by the conventional drilling industry to delay this process. We have been 5 years in the making. We've heard the 28,000 public comments. Everyone's had the opportunity to comment on this. The comments have been responded to. In the legislature, there's been an unconstitutional attempt to do this in 2 different fiscal code bills. It's my conclusion simply that the conventional industry simply does not want to be regulated, does not want to pay the cost. And there is a very real cost to this delay. We're not doing this in a vacuum. I mean, when we do nothing, it means the public is subject to lesser standards. The environment is subject to lesser protection standards. I'm really simply sick and tired of the way the drilling industry has delayed this process, has delayed other things like the severance tax, the control they have over all this. And I think it's just, you know, one of the things I've heard Mr. Marr say on the House floor many times is that the perfect should not be an enemy of the good. And I've also heard it, there will never be a perfect bill. Well, that's true here. I mean, this isn't perfect. This is not perfect. Nothing will be perfect. But this is good. It's needed. Time to put all this nonsense, this delay aside. Time to move forward. Let's vote no on this motion, no on this amendments, get these things in place, and get the public and the environment protected. So I'll be a no vote on this.
On the question.
I'm not sure where you perceive delay. We have this question before us. We have Chapter 78, Chapter 78A. The motion is not about postponing. The motion is about considering them as directed by statute separately. And of course, the board can act to not regard the statute, but I think that will establish a record that will be unfortunate for when this gets challenged in court on that issue.
Are there any other comments on Mr. Waite's motion? All right, then, John.
Can I ask for the department's position on the motion?
We would be opposed. All right, the motion is to amend the original motion to separately consider Chapter 78 and 78A. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. How about raising of hands? Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those opposed? Motion fails. We're still on the question. Are there any other questions, comments?
Well, we have pending amendments.
Well, you got to bring them to the floor.
Well, consider my package of amendments brought to the floor, please.
All right. Well, would you like to make a motion to discuss or to put on the table your First Amendment, Representative?
I'll make a motion that we consider Amendment Number 1, centralized impoundment definition.
All right. I believe all members have that information before them. There's a motion on the floor to consider Representative, how about we call them Representative Marr's amendments, and we'll go through this process just to try to keep it straight for the record. There is a motion, or Representatives made a motion to consider Amendment Number 1. Is there a second? All right, seconded by Bert. On the question, Representative.
Yeah, this package of amendments is intended to largely be technical cleanup for clarity. I do have concerns, as I was expressing, with the overarching process, but these amendments do not get to that. These amendments are largely wordsmithing. This one, for instance, you might have noticed in your reading of Chapter 78 and 78A that centralized impoundment is not actually defined to identify that it deals with wastewater, but merely makes a reference to a form. So this provides a little clarifying language so those that are reading the centralized impoundment parts of the regulation will understand what it is that they're reading about.
Are there any questions or comments? All right, we have a motion that's been seconded to amend the motion on the floor to include Representative Marr's Amendment Number 1. All those in favor, please say aye. Again, we'll ask you to raise your hands. Yes, I suspect we're going to have to count 1, 2, 5. All those opposed? Okay, the motion fails. We'll proceed, Representative, with your second one.
Yes, I'm pretty impressed that even in a matter of a clarifying definition that the department would object. But I will proceed with the second amendment deals with the definition of mine-influenced water. Currently, the department, by permit, allows water from mines to be treated to NPEDS standards, and then it can be discharged into surface water. It's tightly controlled by the department, but that water, in the context of this definition, would suddenly revert to being deemed to be polluted water. So this is, the first element of this amendment makes it clear that this water, which the department allows to be discharged into streams and lakes and rivers, is not the sort of water that is being considered in all the discussions otherwise in the regulation about mine-influenced water. Also, to help provide clarity to those in the public who are trying to conform with this regulation, the department currently is required to, I think it's biannually, maybe it's triannually, to provide a integrated list of all waters in the Commonwealth to EPA. That list is categorized, and two of those categories deal with polluted surface waters, and that would be their lists 4 and 5. And so that there is a concrete reference that people can look to, that if they're drawing water from category 4 or 5, they'd better be mindful of this provision, as opposed to having uncertainty as to whether or not the water source involved is subject to this definition. So again, it's just in the interest of clarity that this amendment is offered, and that's it.
Other questions? John?
Could I ask the department's position?
I'll ask Scott and company.
Sure. Liz and Kurt or Joe Adams to jump in here, but this definition has undergone a fairly considerable amount of review during the development of the rulemaking itself. So the concept here is not of amending this definition is certainly one that has been discussed in our comment response document. But one of the things that is of concern to us is that just because water has been being discharged under an NPDES permit does not necessarily mean that it is clean, and in particular not clean for any watershed in which it may be stored in. Sewage is discharged under an NPDES permit. Industrial waste are discharged under an NPDES permit, and frequently they rely on the assimilative capacity of streams to blunt its otherwise harmful effect. We very much want to encourage the use of degraded sources of water in hydraulic fracturing purposes, but we believe that it is reasonable for the department to evaluate the quality of these waters before we basically allow them to be stored in very lightly regulated impoundments. We need to assume that these impoundments are in fact actively leaking, that they are in high quality watersheds, that the water leaving those impoundments has the potential to get into drinking water supplies. So we need to hold a bit of a higher standard to fluids that are stored in there when in fact we know that they are polluted. So we don't believe that this amendment is a sound amendment to provide the protection that Pennsylvania requires during the hydraulic fracturing processes.
Representative Marr.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I might ask a follow-up question. What is it about storing water that makes it dangerous? If this water is deemed safe enough to be released into streams, into rivers, why does suddenly storing the water make it scary? It seems to me that if this water is scary water, the department wouldn't be permitting it so that it could be released into streams and rivers. So perhaps you don't have faith in the department's permitting process with respect to mine water treatment. I do, and I don't understand that why you think simply storing this water makes it dangerous, whereas if you release it into the rivers, it's okay. It makes no sense to me.
Well, what we are saying is that it should be evaluated to be, so that we can assure ourselves and others that if it is in fact released in the environment, that it's not going to cause an impact. And I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of tubing down the yellow breaches when they are, the discharge from the sewage treatment plant is ongoing, but it's really not necessarily something that you want to, to be bathing in. So just because something is being treated under a permit and discharged does not necessarily mean that it is in fact as clean as the stream that is receiving it. So we think that we need to evaluate this water. We want people to use this water, but it does raise concerns if it is not appropriately managed. And all we're asking here is the ability to evaluate whether it is clean enough that it can be stored in a lightly regulated freshwater impoundment.
Any other questions on this amendment? All right, we'll call for a vote on Representative Marr's amendment number 2. All those in favor of amending the original resolution to include this amendment, please say aye. How to show of hands, please. All those opposed? Motion fails. You want to continue?
3
Sure.
would be dealing with the definition of well development pipeline. To tighten up the definition, which I believe is consistent with what the department has expressed their objective is. As currently defined, the reference to Chapter 78A 65 lacks the specificity to deal with the site restoration at the conclusion of drilling. Without this additional specification, that a well development pipeline would have a lifespan that would go well beyond the temporary nature that's anticipated. My understanding is that the object here is that if a water development pipeline is a temporary one, which is to serve for drilling a well, that when that well is finished, and that well site is the restoration at the end of drilling, that water development pipeline is to be removed. This amendment would provide for exactly that. Without this amendment, you have an open-ended timeline that can go through the time that the well is plugged, which could be 40 years down the road. So this amendment is truly offered to have to make the regulation operative in the way that it's been described. And I hope the pride of authorship issues will not impair the ability to make the regulation technically precise.
I think actually, Representative, you need to make a motion to amend the rule to include this amendment before.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I so move.
Is there a second? Second by Richard. On the question. Richard.
Was this amendment also suggested in the TAB report?
My recollection is yes.
John, do you have a question?
Yeah, again, I would ask the department's position on the amendment.
Scott?
Well, we did have a debate about this particular provision, discussions prior to even this amendment being provided. And as the representative has noted, we firmly believe that the rule as written will not require permanent lines to be subject to this provision. So we certainly just don't believe that it's a necessary amendment that will add value to this rule.
Other questions? All right, all those in favor of the motion to amend to include Representative Marr's amendment number 3, please say aye and raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to consider amendment number 4.
Is there a second? Seconded by Burt. On the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 4 addresses 2 issues. One is that recognizing that the department has provided in section 7865 that the restoration can be subject to the desires of the landowner. For instance, what is a pond that's created for holding surface water at the end of when the well's no longer in sight? People might say, you know, I kind of like having that pond. Let's keep it. And so the department has embraced that and said that owners of the land can make decisions about how the land will be restored. I think that's appropriate. The regulation as drafted is internally inconsistent on this point, though. There's the section which says that landowners have this prerogative, says as long as they're complying with these other sections, which essentially, unless we make it clear it's subject to the owner's prerogative, will make it contradict itself. So most of this amendment is to deal with that question, an internal consistency in the regulation. The second aspect of this amendment is recognizing for conventional wells, not for unconventional, but for conventional wells, that tens of thousands of these wells were drilled, sited decades and decades ago, before anyone was making records of what the contours were before the well was there, or what the conditions were before the well was there. So if we establish a standard that requires restoration to an unknown condition, an unknowable condition, my concern is that this will discourage operators from pursuing restoration because they will be asked to pursue a standard which is impossible to meet. No one knows. So with respect to conventional wells, it provides that the restoration to that original condition is if that condition is known, and not to hold people to an impossible, unknowable standard.
Any questions? John?
Have a position on this amendment?
Scott?
We think that adding this section will actually create more disputes between the department and drillers than it resolves. When you go to a well site, you can clearly understand what the previous condition looked like by looking to the right side of the site, to the left side of the site, upslope and downslope, to know how the land was altered during well development. Now, clearly, if the landowner is fine with that, we agree that they can sign off on it, provided it does not otherwise pose potential environmental harm. And one of those areas where a potential environmental harm may linger is with these large freshwater impoundments. I think it's one thing to allow, in all cases, a parking lot, if you will, to remain, but now when you're talking about an impoundment that can store millions of gallons of water perched above someone else's home, someone else's property, that may exhibit signs of slumping and the like, we ought to retain some authority to in fact, require restoration because it's posing an unreasonable environmental risk to be left in its current condition. So we feel confident that the rule as written allows reasonable choices when restoring sites. We're not demanding that the sites be restored to exact original contours, but they're merely approximate original contours, which would be those that are exhibited by the site surrounding it, and of course, landowners consenting to that condition. So we don't believe that this is a sound choice for Pennsylvania.
Representative Mark.
So I understand that you object to providing the standard with conventional wells to be if known, but are you also objecting to clarifying where the landowner's consent comes into play?
We have a section in a subsection G in that section that speaks very clearly to the landowner consent authorization.
It actually is the source of the problem, Scott, because it refers to compliance with Section A and Section B 2 to 7, and those sections are in order for the landowner's consent to be operative, it must comply with sections where the landowner's consent is not acknowledged. So you have this catch-22 and the way it's drafting. This is just drafting, that if you're genuine in your interest that the landowner should have this ability to consent, I'm simply asking that the wordsmithing in this document be consistent internally. It doesn't change operatively anything. It just makes it clear that the landowner's consent is not obviated by requiring they conform with sections that don't allow for landowner consent. I do not understand the pride of authorship being demonstrated where we can't even have a regulation that's internally consistent. It is very troubling.
Well, I think, Representative, we disagree with your conclusion that it's internally inconsistent. If you look at subsection G, it says that the operator has to develop and implement a site restoration plan that complies with those sections, not that the landowner has to comply with those sections. And frankly, there are concerns with stormwater management that may remain behind even after the site is restored. Post-construction stormwater management requirements may have to be met by the landowner as part of that consent. So it's not in fact something that, we don't see that as being inconsistent. We see it as actually covering all the bases that need to be covered.
You just said that that section requires the operator to comply with these sections that do not provide for the landowner's consent. In the same section where it says the landowner's consent will be respected. But you yourself pointed out that the operator is required to disregard the landowner's consent in order to comply with those sections as written. This is just a matter of getting this thing internally consistent.
I think we disagree. We're just disagreeing with your interpretation of the rule. There's clearly times when post-construction stormwater management features need to be maintained in perpetuity, and a well driller cannot walk away from that responsibility by simply signing it over to the landowner, who himself must agree to maintain those post-construction stormwater features throughout the life of the facility. So there is consent, but the landowner can't consent to creating an environmental impact.
Well, on that point, I would observe that we have long-established laws and regulations that deal with dams that present a hazard. We do not need to be addressing that indirectly here, because after restoration, that impoundment, as you call it, is what other people call a pond or a lake, but it's subject to the laws that exist about dams that apply to all dams in Pennsylvania.
Are there any other questions? All right, the motion has been made and seconded to amend the original motion to include Representative Marr's amendment number 4. All those in favor, please say aye and raise your hands. All those opposed? Motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to propose amendment number 5, the area of review, best efforts requirement.
You are making a motion, correct? You've made a motion, Representative?
I just did, yes.
Is there a second? Seconded by Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The area of review, as was pointed out in the department's presentation, was something that came up from Imagineering in the department. It did not arise from statute. It did not arise from EQB. I think it's not a bad idea, but I do think, in fact, I think it's a good idea, but I do think it's only a good idea if it's a reasonable standard. To ask that operators identify, they say shall identify, things that may not be identifiable is, again, providing a standard that we cannot reasonably expect to be met. So this amendment would introduce the standard that they must use their best efforts to identify, understanding that there are thousands of abandoned wells that were abandoned long before I was born that nobody knows where they are. And to require that someone identify every well within a 18-acre area that may have been there 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when there is no information that would cause one to believe it's there, seems to be an unreasonable standard, which would essentially really impair the ability to harvest this resource. The second aspect of this is to provide a bit of structure to the sources that must be considered. The regulation as drafted provides that the department's well database should be used, and it says the department's well database and other available well databases. Well, if they're available, I'm assuming the department knows about them. And so I would hope that the department would have a list of these other available databases. But I also recognize that some operators have been in the business a long time and may have their own sources. So it's very reasonable to hold them accountable to consulting their own archives. And that's what this amendment would do, require the best efforts of operators to do this research using identifiable sources and their own knowledge.
Any questions? John?
Does the department have an opinion?
Scott?
The way this reads is actually would cause, I think, an enormous cost increase to complying with this particular provision. It requires operators to use best efforts to identify the surface and bottom hole location of these wells. And that would, of course, mean entering the well to physically log it. We were not going to require operators to use best efforts to identify the bottom hole location of wells. Vertical wells were presumed that the bottom hole location would be the same as the surface hole location, which may or may not actually be true. So we think that this amendment doesn't do what the representative purports it to do, and in fact creates more ambiguity. The issue of using other databases and maps has been actually more contentious than many people realize. So we've had a fair amount of consideration of this particular provision and discussion over it. What we had hoped to do actually was have a single database with all of the wells on it, so that there would be a one-stop shop and you wouldn't need to do. I know another amendment is to get rid of the landowner questionnaire. So we asked the industry to provide us with all of their historic maps so that we could digitize them and have this database that would serve as that one-stop shop. And I think we got, it might have been a 7 or 8 page legal brief as to why they're not giving us this information. So we retained the language as it is to include a review of applicable maps, because we do not know where they are all at or who has them. So it's a bit of a soft standard. Utilize our database, which does have the precise location of approximately 9,000 of the maybe more than 250,000 abandoned wells in the Commonwealth, and ask surface landowners who may have direct knowledge of where abandoned wells are located. It's been our experience that many times wells that are in areas where no one suspected a well to be were actually observed to have been drilled by the individual residing there now. That back in the 50s, as a young child, they saw them drill the well. There's no record of it modern, but they know it's there because they were there when it happened. So we believe that after an extensive consideration of all of the comments received on crafting the area of review, that we've done a reasonable job of avoiding unnecessary expenses of having people walk the entire land area where they might not have access to it, requiring invasive procedures like using best efforts to identify the bottom hole locations of wells, and we think that this amendment will create ambiguity and is not necessary.
Any other questions? Richard?
Not so much on the amendment, but since we're in this section, the term farm line maps, can someone tell me what a farm line map is?
Yeah, basically it's more of a historic map that was demarcating property boundaries, and frequently these old farm line maps have locations of oil and gas wells on them.
Okay. Are they available at some central location or?
Operators have them and they refuse to give them to us.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative.
I'm a little confused, Scott, by your analysis that this amendment would increase the cost. The way the regulation's drafted right now, it says the operator shall identify the surface and bottom hole locations. What you offered in your response is that you aren't really going to require the identification of bottom hole locations on vertical wells. If you're not actually going to require it, and if the reason that this amendment to say they need to use best efforts to identify it, the reason you oppose that is you say it's going to add cost because it will require them to identify the bottom hole location that you're not otherwise going to require. If you're not going to require it, why is it in this regulation?
Well, there's a the precise location of horizontal wells that pathway does need to be identified.
Right, that's what the regulation says now.
Right.
So how does this amendment increase cost?
When you use best efforts to identify bottom hole locations, that means entering the well.
You think so?
It's a best effort.
I see. Well, that's a humorous take. Thank you. But you don't, when you say right now they shall identify the bottom hole location, if I understand your testimony correctly, you don't really intend to require that. The regulation just says that, but you're not actually going to require that.
We are assuming vertical wells, the bottom hole location is the same as the surface hole location. Obviously, if there are records indicating, there are intentionally deviated wells, conventional wells throughout Pennsylvania, and obviously if there are records to reflect that there's an intentional deviation in the bottom hole location, that should be provided.
So why don't you have the regulation drafted to say what you're saying you intend to do?
The area that I think you're taking issue with is simply our acknowledging that vertical wells without records will be presumed to have the same bottom hole location as the top hole location.
And where's that in the regulation?
It is not precisely stated in the rules.
It's not said at all. It says quite the opposite.
Many rules require additional technical guidance documents to provide the kind of clarity to nuanced situations that we're describing here today, and that's what we've committed to doing. We've got that language already together, working with our conventional and unconventional oil and gas advisory boards to finalize it. So I think that we are adequately addressing this situation, but certainly the amendment you are proposing would be vehemently objected to by the conventional industry.
Other questions? All right. All those in favor of Representative Marr's motion to amend the rule to include amendment number 5, please raise your hands and say aye. All those opposed? Motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce amendment number 6, dealing with PPC plans.
Is there a second? Seconded by Richard.
In the notice of final rulemaking, the department advises EQB and the public that this subsection is not intended, using these words, not intended to establish any new requirements, and therefore the department attributes no cost to this section. The department states that these provisions, quote, simply reiterate the requirements already existing in Pennsylvania Code Section 9134 and 102.5. There is considerable discomfort in the regulated community that this, in fact, doesn't simply reiterate those sections. So this is a technical amendment in the spirit of having the regulation say exactly what the department says it intended to say in their notice of final rulemaking. So if we don't adopt this amendment, I would ask that the notice of final rulemaking be revised to reflect the change that's happening. But if you're really intending this to be a reiteration of these code sections, well, that's exactly what the regulation should say. So I'm looking to have consistency between what the department says in the notice of final rulemaking and what the regulation, how the regulation is drafted.
On the question. John?
Does the department have a position on this amendment?
Scott?
Sure. The impetus for this change is actually the precise language that is being proposed to be stricken out, and that is that these prevention, preparedness, and contingency plans need to be site-specific plans. And while that word site-specific was not in fact utilized in the previous iteration of the rule, that is precisely what was intended by that rule, but was apparently not being followed. So we needed to have greater clarification that when you are conducting oil and gas activities, you need to have a prevention, preparedness, and contingency plan that actually addresses the things you're doing on that site. So one of the easy examples I like to use is that you have to have the identification of the appropriate hospital if someone needs to go to the hospital. And even within there, you've got some hospitals that don't necessarily have rattlesnake venom and some do. So it might be a good idea to know which hospital in your area has rattlesnake antidote, anti-venom, if you're going to be operating in the hills and woods of Pennsylvania. So if you have a PPC plan that says go to the Mercer County Hospital and you're in Tioga County, then it's not a sufficient plan. So we amended it to require that they be site-specific. But many times, an entire lease for conventional operations may not need to have a plan that varies at all because it's all in the same area. They're conducting their pads in the same way. The wastes and fluids they're storing on site are being managed in the same way. So a quote-unquote generic plan can in fact work throughout. We've tried to make that clear in discussions with industry, but the impetus for this change was in fact having it be site-specific. So this amendment would basically undo the very purpose we opened this section up for change.
Other questions? All those in favor of Representative Marr's amendment number 6, please raise your hand and say aye. All those opposed? Motion fails.
This amendment number 7 I'd like to offer, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Is there a second? Seconded by Richard. Please proceed.
Amendment 7 is a housekeeping sort of amendment. Regulations in the normal course of things do not elevate to the authority of regulation manuals which have not gone through the regulatory process. It's all well and good to have manuals, but they don't belong in the regulation. So this would simply strike the reference for manuals, and I'll note that the department otherwise respected this bit of housekeeping through the drafting of this regulation, but did not in this single instance.
On the question. John?
Does the department have a position on this amendment?
Scott?
First, I'd like to note that the same PPC plan provision that we were just discussing actually does contain a reference to a manual that if operators follow it would be deemed to satisfy the requirements of that particular section. Erosion and sediment control issues are really the #1 environmental problem at both conventional and unconventional sites. It's actually the #1 cause of stream impairment in Pennsylvania, so we take it pretty seriously. We believe that it is helpful to simply reference the guidance that is available to operators so that they can adequately address these issues. The language is not mandating that these manuals are the only things that can be followed in order to comply with the rule. It's simply providing what we believe is a helpful cross-reference to existing manuals and guidance documents so that the industry can adequately address this pervasive problem. I'd also note that the previous reference, this has been part of the surface activities rules, a reference to helpful manuals in this section for as long as I've been with the agency, and we believe it's a practice that ought to continue.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's would be good housekeeping to proceed with the amendment, but I'm going to just withdraw it.
All right.
And I would like to suggest introduce amendment number 8, dealing with road brine.
Is there a second? Seconded by Richard. Go ahead.
I'm no fan of using brine on the roads. I certainly suppose I prefer it to ice, but the corrosive effect it has on vehicles has been quite notable to me in my many journeys across Pennsylvania. So I'm glad that there are restrictions about what sort of brine can be used. I didn't understand in the early days of my awareness of this industry that this brine, for the most part, is essentially it's seawater. It's just seawater from an ancient ocean, which is now buried and is sometimes liberated by drilling, sometimes finds its own way out. What I do want to make a point, though, is that brine is being deemed as being a regulated substance. And it seems to me that we ought to be saying if it's okay to put this thousands of gallons at a time on our roadways, then it better not be something that we're considering otherwise to be this terrible pollutant. So I don't think we can have it both ways. It's if we're either going to call this a pollutant or we're going to say it's okay to put down on the roads. Now, I'd prefer we don't put it on the roads, but the regulation is providing that we do, and we have for years. I'd just like to be clear that what we're putting on the roads is not something that we deem to be poison.
On the question. John?
Does the department have a position on this amendment?
Scott?
The term regulated substance actually applies to things well beyond just pollutants. So if you were to dump, a truckload of milk on the ground, that milk is now a regulated substance. Rock salt utilized to de-ice roads is a regulated substance. We have considered this issue. Your primary concern here is the utilization of brine on Pennsylvania's roadways, and this is a fairly controversial subject because we don't in fact require treated brine to be utilized as a dust suppressant. Untreated brine's been utilized throughout Pennsylvania and other states as a dust suppressant by municipalities for many, many years. It has many constituents in it, including radium and heavy metals, as well as organic compounds. But the application rates and the prohibitions of applying it to roads with a 10% grade or greater or within 150 feet of streams has proven itself to be environmentally protective. So we would actually, and I think the heart of this amendment would be to mandate that only treated brine be utilized in a beneficial way. And we don't have the data to necessarily support having that happen across the board. These numbers are in here for brine to be used as a de-icing agent because, quite frankly, it needs to be very salty in order for it to be effectively used as an anti-icing agent. Brines from most shallow oil wells would probably actually freeze on roads. So that's the reason why we differentiated between the two. But nonetheless, it would be considered to be a regulated substance, but it would not be a violation of our rules if utilized in the manner prescribed.
Other questions?
Secretary, I presume, Scott, that from what you say that this regulatory language has no limiting reach on the state or municipal efforts to de-ice roadways across the Commonwealth?
No, it does not. And in fact, the applicant for this authorization would be PennDOT or the municipal, or if you had a parking lot, I suppose, then it would be an individual. But by and large, the entities applying to use this are municipalities. To date, I don't know that anybody's used brine as a de-icing agent.
I should have also pointed out the amendment recognizing that those who are applying this brine are municipal and state employees. I find it personally intrusive that the employees' names need to be listed, their home addresses apparently, their phone numbers, and the license plates for these state and municipal trucks. Whoever's providing this brine has got to imagine what license plates will be on which trucks at the time that the brine is actually applied to a road. And it seems to me that that's a Nostradamus sort of exercise that is a complete waste of everybody's time, can't really be fulfilled, but it's drafted here, and I'm proposing we at least get rid of the whole license plate thing. I mean, these are municipal trucks.
Other questions? All those in favor of amendment number 8, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? Motion fails. Are there any other motions? Senator.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have 3 amendments. I'd like to move my amendment number 1, which is a clarification relating to the drinking water standards. It's 7851D2 and 78A51D2. For those of you who read...
On that, Senator?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Richard, all right.
For those of you who read the TAB report dated January 16 and you want to refer to it, this addresses a question or a problem which they raised on pages 4 and 5 of their recommendation, and they recommended that this provision relating to drinking water be revised to provide a clearer standard. So what I've done, or what we're proposing in this amendment, is that the drinking water relating to oil and gas, it be identified, the parameters that we're talking about be related to problems caused or parameters that tested by the oil and gas industry, and not something that would be remote from that.
On the question.
I'd like Mr. Perry's opinion of this, please.
Scott?
We certainly agree that the parameters that need to be rectified in the event that the water supply has been affected by oil and gas activities, they will be identified by the department, and that parameters that are otherwise elevated that were not caused by oil and gas activities do not need to be fixed in the course of a water supply restoration. So frequently we see individuals who have total or fecal coliform in their water, which was not obviously caused by oil and gas activities, but elevations of iron or manganese or methane were. So we certainly agree we would not be ordering operators to clean up the coliform problem while they're addressing the iron and manganese problem. One of the concerns that we had with this language was that once we identify the parameters that need to be addressed, a solution can come in a variety of ways, and the solution cannot introduce new contaminants that weren't there otherwise. And this is why we are forming a work group with our advisory board and members of the industry and interested members of the public so that we can craft the guidance document that threads that particular needle very precisely. So the example I'd use is that you've got an iron and manganese problem, and you want to fix it by drilling someone a new water well. And the new water well is fine for iron and manganese, but now you've got elevated levels of barium, strontium, or chlorides. I'd be concerned that this language would now allow the operator to say, oh, I fulfilled my obligations, even though the cure may have actually been worse than the impact. But I certainly, Senator, want to commit to you and other members of the board that this concept of not fixing what you didn't break and identifying methods of restoring water supplies with replacement supplies such that homeowners aren't left worse off is something that we are committed to working with stakeholders to develop the appropriate guidance for. So I believe this amendment may cause concerns for the department down the road, but that we can certainly address the underlying impetus for your amendment to everyone's satisfaction.
Well, my only comment is, once again, this is a recommendation by your own technical advisory board.
I agree, and I certainly wish we would have had an opportunity more fully discuss it as we had other issues throughout this multi-year process.
Other questions? All those in favor of Senator Yaw's amendment number 1, please raise your hand and say aye. All those opposed? Motion fails.
I have an amendment number 2, which is an amendment to 7858G and 78A58G, which is very simple. It eliminates the 3-day notice requirement. And once again, for everybody that read the technical advisory report, which I'm sure everybody did, it's on page 6, and it flatly says we suggest that this language be removed relating to the 3-day notice provision. So, and that's what the amendment does. It removes it.
Is there a second on the motion? Richard, on the question. Hearing none. All those in favor of Senator Yaw's amendment number 2, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? Motion fails.
My final motion is amendment number 3, which would amend section 78A, 59, and 59B relating to impoundments. And this is one that restoring the amendment restores the freshwater impoundment classification. And this is one that we probably need a second.
Yeah, is there a second?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
That's okay.
This is one where the storing of fresh water would not have to meet the same standards for open water areas where, for example, there was residual waste. And this is one where when I questioned the DEP about it, they said that they had never had a situation involving fresh water where there had been a problem. So this is one of those compelling interest arguments that I have. There's never been a problem. Why are we fixing it?
On the question. John.
I have a position on the amendment.
Scott.
Sure. So the scope of this rule applies to it's freshwater impoundments, which historically under our Dam Safety and Encroachments Act, that if your impoundment stored less than 15 acre-feet of water and was shallower than 15 feet deep, it was not regulated. And the unique aspect of oil and gas development, shale gas development, called into question the appropriateness of that decision. So you're talking about impoundments that can basically store 16 million gallons of water. And unlike traditional impoundments that store large volumes of fresh water, it's not actually located on a stream or employing like a valley, say, to impound the fluids. You're taking these facilities and putting them up on top of hills, above people's homes, or at any location. So it's unlike any other industry in Pennsylvania. No one goes and builds multi-million gallon ponds out in the middle of nowhere that can't be replenished, with streams and the like. So we had concerns about the embankments themselves. We're not proposing to require a permit for these impoundments, but we do believe that they need to be constructed using embankments that resist breaching. And when we first met with the Marcellus Shale Coalition to talk about these kinds of issues, we had already developed a fact sheet on best practices for developing freshwater impoundments, which we incorporated into this rule. And they thought that they were always required to do that. So I think the reason why we haven't had a catastrophic failure, and when one of these things catastrophically fails, it's going to be at a minimum damage property, if not potentially seriously injure someone. It could flood a roadway, it could wash out someone's house. But I think that because industry was already following these heightened embankment construction standards, that's probably why we've not had necessarily any catastrophic failures. And personally, I think the department's perspective is that we don't want to wait for there to be a catastrophic failure of one of these impoundments before, when we know we can take reasonable steps to act. Again, we're not requiring a permit, so we're not slowing down the construction process. We're simply having industry build these embankments to a sound engineering standard.
Richard.
What about existing impoundments?
It does not have a retroactive effect.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All those in favor of Senator Yaw's amendment number 3, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? Motion fails. Are there any other motions? Richard.
On behalf of Senator Udicek, I have 5 amendments that I believe have been distributed to everybody, either electronically or hard copies, and I'd like to take them one by one. My first motion is to amend, or have amendment number 1 to amend Chapter 78 and 78A.
Is there a second?
Second.
Senator Yaw, please proceed, Richard.
Okay. This first amendment brings the language in 78.51 and 78.851, protection of water supplies, to be consistent with what's in Act 13. Act 13 uses the language drilling, alteration, or operation of a well as opposed to oil and gas operations.
On the question.
Does the department have a position on the amendment?
The department proposed to amend this particular section because of our long-standing practice of requiring water supplies that are affected by something other than oil and gas drilling or alteration to be restored or replaced. We've had water supplies that have been affected by pad construction, particularly folks. There's a surprising number of people in Pennsylvania that actually use springs as a water supply, and pad construction can actually disrupt that and cause pollution. We've had water supplies affected by horizontal directional drilling where they're putting pipe under streams and the bentonite mud gets into the aquifer and plugs up water supplies. Of course, we've had water supplies affected by mismanagement of wastes and then just through the simple act of drilling. And the statute itself really speaks to water supplies that are affected by drilling, alteration, or operation of the well. And while we know that the presumption of liability does not apply to these other activities, it does only apply to drilling, alteration, and operation, we felt that there was a compelling public need to clearly inform the operators and the public what our expectations are with respect to restoring or replacing water supplies. That if any of your activities pollute a water supply, we will require it to be restored or replaced to the standards specified by Act 13. But we were also clear that the presumption of liability did not apply to those ancillary activities. So rather than engaging in protracted debates or disputes with operators that have affected a water supply by something other than drilling, we felt that it was necessary to include this in the rules so it is crystal clear what our expectations are.
Any other questions?
Do you feel that's an expansion of what the statute says?
The Clean Streams Law is protective of all waters of the Commonwealth, including groundwater. So if it would clearly be an expansion, Richard, if we said that you are presumed to have caused this by your pad construction. That's where I would say that we crossed the line, but we have not crossed that line.
Other questions? All those in favor of Senator Udicek's amendment number 1, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion fails.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, my second amendment, amendment number 2, I move it amends Chapter 78 and 78A, I think, to at least clarify when some information is supposed to be provided by the department.
Second.
Second.
Marr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a literal reading of that section would say that the forms provided through its website 10 business days prior to receipt of all samples, that the form would have to be received on the 10th day, not the 8th day, not the 7th day, not the 11th day. And this would change it so it would say at least 10 business days prior to.
On the question. John?
Does the department have a position on the amendment?
Scott?
Well, I have to admit that we have used the term "at least" in other sections of this rule, did not use it here. Obviously, the precise notification language that occurs throughout Act 13 does not have this word "at least" in front of it. And the department has always told operators that you can tell us you have to tell us you're going to spud the well 24 hours prior to the action. And they could tell us that they're going to spud the well next February 3rd, today. So while this amendment certainly adds clarity, we don't believe it is actually necessary because this is how we implement the program today. We allow operators to give us notice whenever they want, as long as it is before this 10-day cutoff. So fundamentally, we don't believe that adding this language will change how the program is implemented.
All those in favor of Senator Udicak's amendment number 2, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, third amendment that I'd like to offer is an amendment that was brought up in the TAB report that's been mentioned several times, and it regards the questionnaire required under the area of review. So I'd like to move to discuss this amendment.
Senator Yaw seconds. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the TAB report noted, there's a lot of questions regarding this questionnaire that the operator is supposed to submit by certified mail to the landowner. There's no discussion what if the operator does not get a questionnaire back. Is he then responsible for any absence of information? There's no forms provided. And as TAB suggested, this amendment removes that requirement of submitting a questionnaire to the landowner and providing proof of that to the department that information was provided or a questionnaire was submitted to a landowner. We don't know what the questionnaire is supposed to look like and what the process is. So that's what this amendment does, following up on a suggestion or a recommendation of TAB.
On the question. John?
Does the department have a position on the amendment?
Scott?
Well, we actually believe that landowners may be perhaps the best source of information for wells on their property. Again, we attempted to we wanted to address this in a different fashion, in a simpler fashion, by having well locations be made available on the department's database, but we did not get the kind of cooperation that I really expected we would have. So we really believe strongly that utilizing this questionnaire is a very effective way of finding out about wells that there may be no records of. The process that we've outlined is no different than the process the legislature prescribed as part of the well permit process, that water supplies and landowners within a prescribed distance must receive an actual copy of a plat by certified mail. So, and we're not asking for, unlike the well permit, we're not even asking them to provide all of the, the green cards, if you will. And we further expanded the definition of certified mail to be any verified means, so they can use UPS or FedEx or the sheriff, I guess. So it's beyond that. Kurt, would you mind just describing what we will soon have all of the forms that people have been talking about available for our advisory committee's review? I know, Kurt, you've seen this particular questionnaire. Would you mind describing it?
Sure. It's with most of the forms under the regulation, it's pretty much a direct driver out of the regulation itself. The regulation sets a standard. They're required to provide the questionnaire to the landowners, asking them if they have any knowledge of old abandoned or orphan wells on their property, locational information to the extent that they're able to give it to the operator, and the condition of the well to the extent that they have any understanding of that, and if they may not necessarily have that. And the way that the regulation is structured is that the operator doesn't even necessarily need to provide a response to that questionnaire to the department. It's just that when they submit their survey report, they will identify this well was identified as part of a landowner questionnaire, this well was identified as part of the operators actually walking an area, and there's an actual locational information to that, so that when we can populate our databases, and there's some context given to that locational information so that when someone looks at that database, they know that someone actually stood at that site with a GPS unit and took the location, or it was merely anecdotal from a landowner that that's where that well was. So it's actually relatively straightforward, and it kind of gets to some of the questions about the forms and guidances under this rulemaking. Obviously, until the rulemaking has certainty at a certain level, it's difficult to draft what the form would look like or what the guidance document would address. But I think this area in particular is one that I think the guidance document process, development process, has been ongoing with work groups since late last year, I guess December, maybe late November last year. And I think that the work product that's going to come out of that group and that technical guidance document and those forms are going to be at the highest level that the department could generate.
Other questions? All those in favor of Senator Yudichak's amendment number 3, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? Motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I move amendment number 4 in the packet, which amends chapter section 78A.121.
And seconded by Senator Yaw.
Thank you. This amendment touches on the reporting of waste materials. I know Scott touched on this in his presentation about requiring monthly reports for waste materials. The amendment would change the reporting to every 6 months. I think monthly is a little onerous. Everybody hears about how we're drowning in paper or emails, and I believe other waste streams are not reported on a monthly basis, hazardous waste, municipal solid waste. If anything, they're reported quarterly, and I think if we report it twice a year, it would give the operators time to submit more accurate information. And I think if the department actually, if there's a problem and they need information, they can always go to an operator and request it. So this just changes the reporting to every 6 months instead of monthly.
On the question. All those in favor of Senator Yudichak's amendment number 4, please raise your hand and say aye. Up.
Scott, I just have a question. Am I correct in saying that other waste streams are reported less frequently? I believe that was the case.
Well, certainly hazardous waste is tracked much more rigorously with an actual manifest. And there was some desire, actually one of the many comments we received on this particular subject is that we should require a manifestation. I believe Ohio is considering that now. Our concern, frankly, is that if we're going to do a manifest, it needs to be done electronically, because having 100,000 pieces of paper, you get the pink one, I get the yellow one, and he keeps the white one, is not a way the department should operate any longer. But we have identified, and the public has identified a compelling need here for greater transparency in the manner in which these wastes are managed. And the times that we've gone in and evaluated these reports, we've found considerable errors. So this is self-reporting waste management. I know that the public has a lot of questions about that. They don't believe that they do not believe the veracity of these reports, and the story that the department can't necessarily substantiate the claims that it is all being managed appropriately, because the review we've done already has indicated a fairly high error rate. So we think that we need to be much more diligent in our review of these records, and it needs to be done more timely so that we don't have 6 months or a year go by and millions of gallons of wastewater are unaccounted for.
Scott, can I make a point in response to your comment, Mr. Fox, that the department already has a production and waste reporting, electronic waste reporting system in place. And in fact, we've built the capability to receive these reports on a monthly basis. And some operators can voluntarily actually do the monthly reports now and are doing the monthly reports now. So I think you're concerned about, the volumes of paper being generated, that sort of thing. We've already addressed that issue because it's going to be a fully electronically reported system that's going to be publicly available, as the data updates every month. So I'll make that point.
Other questions? All those in favor of Senator Yudichak's amendment number 4, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? Motion fails.
All right. See if I keep my record going. Amendment number 5 amends the order on page 1.
Senator Yaw seconds.
Very simply, the amendment would change the effective date of the rulemaking to 180 days after publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Essentially, when these rules are most extensive rulemaking the department has had probably in over a decade. Appreciate the work, as Scott said, the beginning of everybody's hard work. When they get published on a Friday electronically and a Saturday in a hard copy, they're in effect for the industry. We've all heard the discussion today about how many forms, technical guidance documents have to be developed, things have to be worked out. I think a 6 months extension would allow operators in the department to finalize forms, guidance documents, and train field staff, have training for the industry so that there's a smooth transition to these new regulations.
John? Yep, I can handle it. Work on this package began almost 5 years ago. We have gone through an unprecedented, transparent, public process. This rule has obviously been well scrutinized. It's time to finish the job and to put these reasonable, balanced, and incremental protections for public health and the environment into effect. We are opposed. Any other questions? All those in favor of Representative Refugee Tax Amendment number 5, please raise your hand and say aye. Those opposed? The motion fails. Are there any other motions? Seeing none, the motion before us is the original one, the motion to approve by this board to approve Chapter 78 and Chapter 78A final rulemaking.
On that question?
On the question.
Those of us around this large table are either members of the Environmental Quality Board or alternates for members. In either case, the Environmental Quality Board is the entity that has the statutory authority alone to formulate and promulgate regulations that deal with the environment. Now, as a practical matter, there are certainly departments, often it's DEP, sometimes it's other departments, who essentially staff that undertaking. But it is not their undertaking. It is the undertaking and the responsibility of the members of this board. In the instance of this regulation, while the chairman says some unprecedented transparency, I'll remind members of this board that in conjunction with our responsibility specific to this regulation, I asked during an EQB meeting last year for simply having information provided to board members relevant to the regulation. The chairman declined. So not only has our staff not been transparent, it has in fact obstructed the ability of the Environmental Quality Board members to do their responsibility. That should never be the case. I certainly don't feel like I had a part in formulating these regulations. I don't know how you can look in the mirrors and think that you did as members of the UQB. When we see something as simple as a typo correction or the common sense of saying a regulation shouldn't say something has to arrive in the mail on a date certain, but up at least that many days ahead. When we see that that's objected to, I have to just shake my head. Where's the common sense? I wasn't part of this board when the original rulemaking was published, but I am aware that the information required to be provided to IRC was not provided. IRC certainly corresponded to that effect. Some of that information still doesn't exist. We know that before we consider rules and regulations, we're required under the Regulatory Review Act to have the forms that are associated or referred to by those regulations available, not just for our purposes, but for the public. Those forms aren't here. We're hearing they're going to be developed. You're being asked to ignore your statutory duty to break the law about how regulations are written and adopted. The governor could appoint anybody with the appropriate qualifications to the Technical Advisory Board, and he appointed people. Their recommendations in the document, very thoughtful document, disregarded. The governor created, with conjunction with the chairman, the Conventional Oil and Gas Advisory Committee. They chose who they wanted on that committee. The governor's appointees again. Their thoughts disregarded. We hear today in explanations about some of these proposed amendments to the regulation that the answer is, well, we're not really going to do what the regulation says. We're going to do something else. Is that transparent? Don't we have a duty to the public that what's published as a regulation is something they ought to be able to pick up and understand, not have to depend on some insider grapevine that, oh, well, if you know so-and-so, just talk to him because they don't really follow the rule. We should never be adopting regulations when we're hearing from staff that we don't really intend to do that. That's not even cold comfort. It's actually sort of frightening that we're going to publish a regulation that pretends we're going to do one thing, when in fact the intention is to do something else. I don't care what the subject is, that's wrong. And I don't get the resistance to simply having the regulation say what the department claims they intend to do. I don't understand why there should be a gulf between them. I don't understand why you're being asked to vote to embrace that gulf between them. This is a very important subject. I had hope at the beginning of last year that this commitment to openness and transparency that was voiced was going to be a real thing. But in fact, we have a regulation which violates a statute that says these should be regulated in two different actions. We have the violation of the statute that says you can't adopt regulations until you've published the forms. We should do this right. And before we pat ourselves on the backs about all the good we're doing for the environment, every condition that we've heard about that's a terrible consequence of things gone wrong, every one that we've heard about either with historical references or imaginations of what could go wrong, every one of those things is already illegal. Already illegal. So where's the incremental protection of the environment? We're making it illegal again. Well, it's still illegal. Those things are not legal now. So before we walk out of here and pat ourselves on the back, keep in mind, the things that are wrong and we don't want to see happen are already wrong. But what I don't like to see done wrong is writing regulations in violation of statute and in telling the public what the regulation says and what the department intends are two different things. So I would have preferred, I had some hope that maybe we could at least clean up some of this technical stuff, but if we can't even do that, I cannot support violating the law by proceeding at this time.
Let me ask Attorney Child for some clarification with respect to legal issues.
I just want to advise the board that the Office of General Counsel actually plays a role in this entire process, and that's really part of my being here and Liz's being here and the other attorneys that in our office. The Office of General Counsel is an independent office of the governors, and quite frankly, our responsibility in this process is to review what's going on, review the rules that are being proposed by the department, to look at the legality of what's required under the Regulatory Review Act. Representative Marr is correct about the Environmental Quality Board having a unique role in the process here with the Department of Environmental Protection. I don't believe any other department of the Commonwealth has an entity like the Environmental Quality Board. It was actually came into being back in 1970-71 when the Department of Environmental Resources was created, which predates the Regulatory Review Act in Pennsylvania, which is the act that establishes the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. But this board continues to function even though we do now have that whole separate body that reviews every agency's regulations. So the Department of Environmental Protection actually has the distinction of having more oversight of its regulations and involvement of various departments, the legislature, than direct involvement in a way that no other department of the Commonwealth has. So when Representative Marr indicates that this rulemaking violates the law, that's not true, and that has been reviewed very vigorously by the Office of General Counsel. We have looked at everything the department's doing and requiring. We have looked at the Regulatory Review Act. We have looked at all the authorities that this rulemaking is functioning under, and we have advised the General Counsel that this rulemaking, in fact, can and should go forward. So I just want to respond to that issue here.
Mr. Chairman, if I could address the General Counsel.
Briefly.
Thank you. The Regulatory Review Act requires forms to be included with regulations. Is that right?
It does.
Can we, as a board, waive that requirement, or is that a statutory obligation that we have?
We have talked to the staff at the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, and even though the statute says that, that is not a practice that occurs because of the very reasons that the program has identified here, even though it's in there. The reality is the forms, until the rulemaking is finalized, often can't be developed. So they are not. In fact, most times we do forms all the time, and they have not been included as with other departments. So yes, technically you are absolutely correct. The statute does say that, but as you know, there are many times when statutes say things, and the whole intent of the Regulatory Review Act is to provide transparency in the process. And as the department has indicated, those forms are in development, the technical guidance is in development. So from a legal standpoint, we did flag that. The folks here at the table know that. We identified that as an issue. But it was not an issue sufficient to say to the department that they needed to stop this rulemaking from moving forward.
And you had talked about this board as if it were something like IRC. And I would suggest that it's nothing like IRC.
I did not say that.
Okay, you talked about a level of review, because in this case, just for the clarity, the members, the EQB is responsible for formulating and promulgating regulations dealing with the environment, not DEP.
That's correct. I didn't say otherwise. But the board's role is to promulgate regulations to enable the Department of Environmental Protection to do the work that it needs to do.
I agree with you, but it's the board's responsibility to formulate. Now, how do you suppose the board is supposed to formulate when DEP obstructs the board from getting information relevant to the regulations under development?
Representative, that's not true. That is simply not true.
I asked you, Mr. Chairman, in a public meeting, and I'm sure there's a tape of that meeting. I asked you for information, you refused it.
You asked me for information that didn't exist.
No, it did
Real
exist.
simple. Now, I'm wondering if there's anyone else on the board that wants to talk here this morning? John?
I'd just like to say that, and this is a comment for the entire board, I've been coming to board meetings since the 1980s when I was an alternate for Ralph Abel when he was our director. And I have to say, I really, as a member of the board, appreciate and respect the role that we have as board members in promulgating rulemaking to direct the department on where we need to go with environmental protection and balancing economics. The regulations before us today are not only necessary, but they're the right thing to do. And that's the standard that I've reached based on an independent analysis of the regulations, not deferring to the department or anyone else. My staff and myself have independently reviewed them, and we believe it's the right thing to do. And they're long overdue, as I said before. I believe as a board and part of Commonwealth government, we have a constitutional duty. We talked about the constitutional challenges before, but we also have this constitutional duty in this Article 1, Section 27 of the Constitution that we have that is every bit as important as any other article of the Constitution, and that's been described by the courts. As trustee for our air, water, soil, and public natural resources, to preserve them for not only the present generation, but for all future generations. And I'm going to be voting in favor of these amendments to the regulation because it's the right thing to do, and I encourage you to do the same.
Roger.
Mr. Secretary, as a relative newcomer to the board and on behalf of our department and Secretary Richards, I want to acknowledge and commend the department and Deputy Secretary Perry for the responsiveness that he showed to me in ensuring that I was fully informed to all of the issues that I needed to be made known of, and to answer my questions thoroughly and to follow up with additional information. And as far as responsiveness and provision of information, I thought that was exemplary, and I want to thank you for that.
Other members? John?
Previous question.
All right, this is a procedural issue. I'm going to ask Kim to explain what that motion means. Well, do we have to have a second first? Second first?
Well, let me explain, just so everybody knows what John has asked for. And as you know, this board follows Robert's Rules of Order, and what the motion that John has made is a motion that basically ends the debate and calls for the original question to approve the regulations as presented to be voted on. It is a motion that requires a 2/3 vote of the body, so we will need a hand count just to make sure that we've done all of that. So procedurally, that's what that motion is. So now you can ask for it to be seconded.
Is there a second?
I'm not second, I have a question.
No.
Okay. Well, it's a procedural question?
No, comment question.
Well, then it needs to be seconded, and then you can
second the motion
you can
before
talk
we
about it.
have any discussion. Representative Vitale seconds. All right. On that, is this debatable?
Actually, now that you say that, let me look that up, because
Consult the
actually I
rules.
think that it's not something that I think I've ever had to answer before, but let me just make sure I answer correctly, because this little book does give all of those answers. No. The answer to the question is no, it is not debatable. So it is just, we just need to vote. You just need to vote.
All right. The motion, this is a motion for the previous question. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand and say aye, and we're going to do a count. Pat, count too. And I vote on this one, right?
Please keep your hands raised.
Please keep your hands up. We want to triple check this.
How many did you get?
13? All right. The vote is 13 in favor. All those opposed?
Is he voting on it?
1, 2, 3,
How many do we need?
14, two-thirds, 20. All right. There were 13 ayes, but we need 14 for that motion to carry. That's a two-thirds majority, so that motion fails. So we're back on the question. Senator.
Thank you. I wasn't going to say anything, but my concerns, and there are several members of my committee, not all of my committee, which have serious concerns about the way that these regulations were put together, and I think you could tell from my questioning, it was, is there a compelling interest and what's the cost involved? I think that those are the overriding things. I am not saying that there are not some things that do not need regulation and should be revised. But when I hear things like, well, we've never had a problem, but we're going to address it anyway. These are regulations, some of these, they're regulations looking for a problem. And the way I look at regulations is they are designed in there's a need. Is there a need for them? Not because something might happen. What has happened? What's the history been? And I just think that sometimes we've overlooked that. There's some good parts of these regulations, but by and large, I have serious concerns. And as I said, several members of my committee have concerns about the way that they've been put together. And I'm sure that there's going to be significant challenges to them as a result of that. Thank you.
Other question, Bill.
I just want to say that I've been involved with this since since I've been on the EQB. These were one of the first set of regulations. Wasn't comfortable at that time because the tab at that time was not comfortable moving them forward. We're back again as a final package. Both the advisory committees are a little hesitant to move them forward. So that's kind of why I'm remain hesitant to vote for them. So thank you. That's all I have to say.
Other comments? Seeing none. All those in favor of the motion to approve the Chapter 78 and Chapter 78A final rulemaking, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. We're going to keep your hands up, please. Got it. Those opposed? Thank you. The motion passes. The rules are approved by this board. In other business, the next meeting of the EQB is tentatively planned for Tuesday, April 19th, 2016. We will not have a meeting in March. I want to thank all board members for your diligent and careful review of this package, and I especially want to salute my staff for their incredible work over the last almost 5 years to create and craft this package, which is reasonable, balanced, and incremental, and certainly protective of Pennsylvania's public health and the environment. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Representative Vitale, is there a second? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Thank you. We are adjourned.